Okay, so we'll continue on with the same topic of promoting ethnic agenda and the ethnic mobilization or mobilization along ethnic lines in Latin America, especially after the neoliberal turn. We covered what happened in a way or another in Ecuador with the emergence of this unified peasant confederation between Andeans and Amazonians. And next week, we are going to touch upon anti-neoliberal mobilization or the emergence of populist leaders in Venezuela and Ecuador. So we're going to cover the emergence of Korea in Ecuador. And for more information about how actually they internalize or how they actually promote this ethnicity or frame the struggle in ethnic language or identity terms, you can go to Yashar chapters on ethnic mobilization or corporatist regime and neoliberal citizenship regime, especially in Ecuador. So today we're going to cover movement towards socialism in Bolivia and how it differed from ethnic mobilization in Bolivia before the 90s or before 2000 and late 90s until 2005 when Morales with his movement reached power in Bolivia. And as I mentioned, we are going to tackle the topic from a cultural perspective or constructivist perspective. So meaning we need to get some interview data or some information from ethnographic researches in order to see how people actually assign meaning to their social and political context in order to frame the struggle in identity term or to actually to mobilize along or to appeal to wide masses and to mobilize them along ethnic agenda or ethnic lines. So part of this is the emergence of the ethnic populist parties. And like the prototypical case is the movement towards socialism or towards socialism in Bolivia, because it actually reached power because and it's with this populist appeal that actually coincided with its ethnic content or ethnic ethnicity, the signification of ethnic identities. It offered some sort of puzzling case because according to different streams in the existing literature, it would be kind of unexpected affinity between populism and ethnicity. And as I mentioned, when we tackled the issue before with this kind of unexpected affinity between neoliberal populism or the populist leaders promoting or advocating for neoliberal policies. So by the same token, actually here, the neoliberal turn gave way to different populist leaders or different political outsiders to emerge. And with Bolivian case, Morales was in a way or another a political insider because he actually entered the parliament in the late 90s and got expelled from the parliament in 2002 and then leading the movement to socialism until reaching power at the national level in 2005. Putting an end to the traditional three parties. So how did these parties, or basically the movement to socialism, did that? So in order to investigate what happened, so again, like the literature tackles this from different perspectives. So some studies actually focused on institutional framework or this political opportunity structures, and basically Yashar mentioned offered some sort of complex analysis or layered argument by focusing on this kind of political opportunity structure with the with the return of democracy and opening up the political landscape and guaranteeing constitutionally and legally some electoral and political rights alongside social and civic rights, and and as well, like she drew upon another stream in the literature of social mobilization, social movement as well, by focusing on the organizational capacity or an organizational basis that actually enabled indigenous population or indigenous movement to mobilize and to actually to articulate a common agenda and to heighten their identity, and to contest and resist this imposition of all-encompassing class identity inherited from the corporatist era. So she focused on this political opportunity structure on the one hand, and these trans community networks or organizational basis and associational space that actually offered some, in a way or another, organizational capacity to indigenous population and peasant confederation to mobilize when the political environment became much more permissible with the return of democracy and the retreat of the military regimes. Van Gogh focused mainly on this institutional framework and electoral rules that enable different indigenous parties and the indigenous movement to transform themselves into political parties, and then to join, the electoral contestation, and to make use of the existing to make use of the permissible or conducive electoral institutional rules. So as I mentioned, this week we tackled, the issue of ethnic mobilization from constructivist or culturalist perspective, because we need to know how actually the appeal to white segments in society, and especially in some cases when indigenous parties or the movement turned into a party, appeal to white segments of society or beyond its core indigenous constituencies. So it's methodologically useful to get like some reflections from indigenous population or indigenous leaders in order to see how actually they frame their struggle, how what kind of political platform they campaigned on in order to appeal to wide masses or to reach beyond their core constituencies, and then to reach even like power at the national level, as the case in Bolivia. So again, like this is from like your methodology and comparative politics course. We focus on this kind of politics of signification, or like agency as or actors as signifying agents. So how they actually how they promote different discourse or different sort of practices, and then from these practices and from the new sort of articulated practices and discourses, how people actually internalize new values and new norms. They develop these norms firstly, and then internalized by white segment of the population, and then how they actually politicize this in their struggle in order to reach power. So I touched upon this last lecture when we mentioned Madrid's article about how he covered actually, or he offered some sort of critical review of the existing literature, how this like the juxtaposition between like ethnicity and populism had been unexpected before the Morales or his movement actually reached power. And then by the focus on this broader political and economic campaign that actually appeal to non-indigenous population as well. So the movement, so Morales actually cultivated support um, or indigenous support on the one hand, but actually he actually gained some support, some base of support amongst even whites and uh, leftist parties and or leftist intellectuals that actually had this class-oriented perspective, or this meaning that's based on class struggle or class conflict. So so how so the in order to investigate or to examine how the movement, how Morales and the movement to socialism actually reached power and gained wide support by 2005, and offered itself as an alternative representative avenues, not only for indigenous population, but also for different segments or disaffected classes and segments in society. So regardless of like there, as I mentioned, like there was and there has always been kind of social polarization in Bolivia, but the thing is, at this point, from 2002 to 2005, with the nationwide mass protest against privatization and some neoliberal measures, the gas war and water war, this enabled the leadership of the movement to frame the struggle in a broader term, in order to appeal to wide masses. And as I mentioned, there like a couple of weeks or 3 weeks before, there was kind of struggle between highlands and lowlands with some demands for self-autonomy, with the formation of civic committees or some sort of other movement that actually pushed for separatist policies or asked for regional autonomy. But at this point, it was like a breaking point, or in a way like a critical period that enabled Morales to cultivate the struggle, or to actually to reframe the struggle in a broader sense, and to reestablish or reconstruct, you know, the fluid identities of different population or different segments in society. So the assumption here is like some segments in Bolivian society didn't have this kind of fixed um, self-identification. So in addition to their indigenous language, or their affiliation with particular indigenous group, so they may have like they didn't have any kind of objection to reframe the struggle, or to have kind of coalition, or to reach beyond their narrow boundaries. So unlike, you know, the ethnic mobilization in the 80s and 70s. So by adopting this non-exclusionary approach, like the movement, despite the internal disputes or internal contestation, by broadening its inclusionary policies or inclusionary frame, it attracted some other like indigenous population, and reached beyond its limited regional domain when it initially emerged in Cochabamba. So in this context, like wide masses or wide segments of society are actually at this point are dissatisfied with the existing political establishment, with the existing economic and social policies. So it would be like strategically unpalatable to adopt this exclusionary approach by focusing on, by having, you know, this narrow focus on Indianness, or just only exclusive focus on indigenous identity, and relegating other grievances, political and economic grievances, to the margin, wouldn't have allowed him to appeal to wide masses or wide segments in society. So actually it was like detachment from the existing political establishment. So Morales actually campaigned as a populist leader. He campaigned on, capitalized or invested in this detachment between voters or electoral constituencies and the existing traditional parties, MIR, MNR, and END. He capitalized on this by designing the electoral campaign and the entire political discourse of the movement on anti-establishment or anti-elitist foundation. And drawing or mapping onto, you know, this kind of rising resistance or escalating conflict, economic and social conflict with the implementation of or pushing through these neoliberal measures, especially privatization of hydrocarbon sectors and natural enabling multinational corporation or foreign firms to penetrate, again, the indigenous lands and to, for them, like exploit their natural resources. So he actually articulated a broader or a national economic program that promised greater role of the state, interventionist role of the state, and nationalization of some of the enterprises. For the demands of like a fair distribution of wealth and more just social order, the discourse actually focused on this fair distribution of national wealth and the preservation of the natural resources of the country. So by these kind of he combined these kind of political demands, this anti-establishment discourse, and social and economic demands, and blended these together in order to appeal to broader constituents. And you can, in a way or another, so you need to, if you can, we know this by analyzing, you know, the electoral campaigns and focusing on the wording or how Morales actually in his speeches highlighted and actually framed the struggle in these broader terms, and we are going to see this shortly. So for indigenous fragmentation in Bolivia, so here La Paz and Cochabamba, they were like the major cities where a strong and fierce resistance emerged in the late 90s and through 2005 until Morales assumed power. So according to national census in Bolivia, and that was cited in Madrid's article, half of the population actually spoke indigenous language. And 2/3 of the population identified with ethno-linguistic category. So the predominant or the two big indigenous communities or indigenous groups were Aymara speaking provinces or communities, and Quechua speaking communities as well. So it was like the Quechua speaking indigenous community did account for roughly 28% of the population, and Aymara 18.5%. There are like two different sources you can access in order to, if you are interested in public opinion and survey data. So you have like Latino Barometro and LaPob, Latin American Public Opinion Project. So you can have like more information about ethnic composition and partisan identification and whatever question you are interested in. So in this context of ethnic and indigenous fragmentation, ethnic mobilization was hardly new to the Bolivian context. But what was striking or remarkable with the emergence of Morales, or with reaching power at the national level, was like this the alignment or the collapse of the entire party system by 2005. But before, in order to distinguish or to examine to what extent the MAS distinguished itself or its struggle from, or to what extent it differed from the previous indigenous and ethnic mobilization in Bolivia. So we need to go a little bit back in order to highlight what kind of ethnic mobilization was there before Morales emerged as undisputed leader of white indigenous communities. Um, with Aymara group, the first like young group of this community or indigenous community, they formed their Catarista movement in order to that was identified and to commemorate their leader Tupac Katari. And they actually started to mobilize in the late 70s and through the mid 90s. So again, like the turning point was the dismantling of the corporatist organizations that actually incorporated or integrated and framed the struggle in class terms before the implementation of market-oriented policies. So as it happened in Mexico, there was like a revolution in Bolivia led by MNR in 1952. And after this like nationwide popular mobilization that put an end to the traditional elites and brought to the forefront different elite circle or different political class. So they actually started to incorporate, to cultivate like labor and peasant support, and to build their corporatist organization in order to offer them, in order to control their demands and to offer them a wide support base. So they incorporated, you know, peasants or the indigenous communities as peasant again in class terms, in order to offer the support base for the MNR, for the MNR's regimes or governments. And that continued even with the military coup that it was like very common, like populist leaders implementing these kind of far-reaching redistributive demands that led to social struggle and social conflict, social polarization, and this enabled the military to step in and to establish or to install its own regime or government. So the military regime as well, they established under Parrientos, they established this military peasant pact, but again, it eroded, you know, the autonomy of the indigenous community, and they had to cultivate, or in a way to co-opt or to control, you know, the leadership of these confederations in order to control their demands, even with the distributing of some material and economic benefits. So they like peasants, you know, were essential component in the pact, but again, like the community or the indigenous communities and networks started to develop this resentful feelings against losing, you know, their local autonomy or the autonomy that enjoyed before amongst their members. So with the exhaustion of, or like when some sort of economic stagnation or economic hardship started to emerge in the mid 70s, so the government or the regime had to implement some harsh austerity measures and to stop like these. There's no land actually to go around, or to distribute, you know, some more lands in order to appease or in order to to alleviate, the rising resistance or anger of the indigenous community or the peasant community there. So with these kind of rising prices of some of the basic goods like sugar, oil, um, these kind of basic, consumer goods. So and the exhaustion of or the blocking or stoppage of these wide distributive measures. So peasants or the indigenous communities started to mobilize and to resist the economic and social policies of the military regime. And it ended up by harsh, a crackdown. The military harshly and brutally suppressed the mobilization. It was like in rural areas and urban protests as well, and it ended up with massacring, some of the peasants communities, and to put an end to this mobilization. But again, they throughout this period, and they had their own unions and their own like civic or community networks and organizations that actually enable them to mobilize when it was needed, or even like during like harsh or during the repressive, military period. So they managed to contest or to vocalize their opposition and resistance. But again, so the central point here, how Catarista or the indigenous community in and indigenous peasant communities, they had their own semi-autonomous trans community networks that actually offered them the capacity to mobilize. And then after the return of democracy or after the withdrawal of the military, so it offered them like a permissible opportunity, political opportunity structure in order to ask for more, or to form or to establish their own parties. But they focused on their ethnic identity during that period, and their own like civic rights and their social rights. So what was there during the 70s and early 80s? So they focused on the articulation of their ethnic identity through rural unions again, and the existing schools. One common theme in Latin America, and that differed from one country to another country, like peasant community or indigenous communities, they have their own local networks or local organizations, and they use their these like avenues or these interactive spaces, physical spaces, in order to interact and to revive and to maintain their to practice their indigenous customs, and to preserve their own indigenous cultural identity. So actually, they had their own, and they were inspired by some intellectual leaders as well. So they had their own schools, and that started to started actually from emerged from these educational domain, and they started to defend and to resist the dominant class identity, and to actually to heighten or to stress, to emphasize and assert their indigenous identity. So in schools, one famous movement was like November 15th movement, and the university movement, Quilan Abaza. And they opted for this mobilization through political parties. So they formed like different political parties that eventually like culminated into this Tupac Katari, the Indian movement of Katari in 1978. So they had like different strategies, like capitalizing on existing networks in order to instill like different indigenous educations and to raise consciousness about their own like different culture or their inherited civilization, and they had their own like rural unions. Firstly, this National Confederation CNTCP, and then unified and renamed to CCU-TCP. That like the unified peasant confederation actually enabled Morales later, to emerge as undisputed leader, and he actually chaired the confederation and led the struggle in Cochabamba, especially the coca growers, between the coca growers. So they articulated their ethnicity through these educational spaces and rural unions and these corporatist arrangements or corporatist through these corporatist arrangements or corporatist organizations, and they had their own. This is like a common theme as well in between indigenous population in Latin America. So they have their own networks or trans community networks that brought together like different or connected, different indigenous population, or even from the same like community but in different geographical areas. So they have their own civic cultural center. So they use their what they call like popular music. So they need to revive their indigenous or their unique or different cultural practices, or like in terms of music or different artworks. So they had their cultural centers that offered them space in order to revive, these different popular cultures. And again, like church played important role in bringing together different members and different elements of indigenous population or indigenous communities. And in Bolivia, the most important avenue that had like several collective activities that help them in offering them like new information and space to process, thoroughly, the new cultural norms, and this kind of how to negotiate their identity in relation to the state or in relation to this imposition of the class identity. So they had like the church affiliated research advocacy groups that actually enable them to interact and to negotiate and to develop different understanding about their identity. And again, like some sort of collective activities. So again, like I conducted field work in other Latin America, in other Latin American countries. But when it comes to these kind of collective activities, so they had like some common activities, like reviving, using their musical instruments, for example, using their own dancing, or their own like clothing, or sayings, or proverbs. So even like they have these kind of symbolic activities or symbolic actions, like flying their own flags, in order to the meaning they would assign to this, that they enjoyed some sort of cultural autonomy inside, this broader frame of nation state. And they have like, in order to revive their history, or to pass this, or to educate their children about their heritage or their history. So they have like, they use these cultural centers or even streets, to use graffiti and to commemorate their martyrs, or what they depicted as like heroes, or people who massacred by some repressive and oppressive regimes. So this would actually enable them to link their contemporaneous resistance, to link this up to their legacy or historical patterns of challenges and resistance. So this through like different using different cultural spaces, like cultural centers, or even like using artworks to transmit their, or to disseminate their to get their message across, and to disseminate their narrative or their own story. So So they actually had these kind of collective activities and this kind of community networks that offered them the capacity, even if within the context of harshly repressive military regimes, they were not able to mobilize when the military withdrew and enabled civilian elites to come back and to rule the country. So they offered, some political opportunities to these organizational and to these local organizations and to these community networks to emerge and to mobilize wide segments of indigenous communities. So again, like in order to examine or to master evidence regarding this transformation or how they reassert their ethnic identity in relation to class identity, in relation to the state effort to impose this class identity or to strip them of their ethnicity or ethnic identity. So you have what the unified peasant confederation. They had like their political manifesto in 1983, and from their words, so you can know what kind of meaning they internalized, what kind of a story or narrative or different norms and values they try um, uh, to disseminate, or they articulate in their own effort to resist the imposition of the class identity. So according to this, the manifesto, it's cited in Yasher's chapter. It's in your reading list. According to this manifesto, they rejected this reductionist view and this limitation of the identity to either like a class identity or ethnic reductionism. And this is the way how they framed, the struggle in the early 80s. So we, the current leaders, refuse to accept and will never accept class reductionist ideas, which transform us to the status of mere peasants. So they actually obviously rejected, this class frame or this imposition of class identity on them, nor did we accept ethnic reductionism, and this would transform their struggle into confrontation between Indians and whites. So they rejected any kind of feeding into or investing in this like antagonistic boundary between Indians and mestizos or whites. And this is how they portrayed it. We are the ears of great civilizations. So they actually take pride in their own heritage or their own legacy, and they frame their permanent struggle against all forms of exploitation and pressure. So they didn't have any kind of hatred against whites or different um, ethnic groups, but they framed their struggle or the resistance that actually directed this against exploitation and pressure. So we want to be free in a society where exploitation and organized oppression do not exist, in a state which recognizing all national groups. So it was like a unified and some sort of inclusive approach, instead of triggering or producing hatred in society between different ethnicities or different national groups. So they actually recognized all the existence of the right of the existence of all national groups, and develops our different cultures and authentic forms of self-government. So they started to defend their local autonomy, and they rejected any form of erosion of their local autonomy, or this kind of heavy presence or intervention from the state by co-opting or influencing their the leadership, or the leadership of the peasant confederation, the unified confederation. So our oppressors, so this is how they actually assign meaning to the social context, they lived in. So they, not as whites, but as exploitative and oppressive elites, they have attempted systematically to strip us of our historical identity by a variety of methods. So they tried to make us forget our true origins and reduce us to mere peasants and with no personality, history, or identity. So they actually resisted, this imposition of class identity. And our entire history has demonstrated that we know how to resist such attempt, and this heightened, their indigenous character. And then the green one, we can achieve liberation without losing our cultural and national identity, without being ashamed of what we are, and we will recover our lost dignity. So again, this is how they actually framed their struggle against existing exploitative oppressive structure. And they spotlighted, or they highlighted, their right to preserve their own cultural autonomy, or to ethnic identity as a source of dignity. So this is like more or less like a common theme, but they differ between different indigenous populations or different indigenous communities, but they differed in their organizational capacity and the willingness to adopt, this inclusivity or inclusive approach to get more or to include like more different communities. I touched upon this before when we talked about like the gas war and the water war in Cochabamba, and I mentioned something about like how the implementation of this market-oriented reform or market-oriented policies, so it actually led to, it was like inefficient mining enterprises. So the state decided actually to close these enterprises. So one of like peasants who migrated before to work in in mining sector, with selling off or closing, these inefficient public enterprises or state-owned enterprises. So these people became jobless, and in order to advance their livelihood, or to guarantee like the minimum level of like good economic and living conditions, so they resorted to the coca sector, or to grow coca in Chapari province. So mainly this like the Cochabamba and the around, Cochabamba. So from this struggle of according to the package of the economic reform, the U.S. sponsored a program called Coca Eradication, or a program that actually depicted, this growing coca as a kind of drug trafficking. One of the indigenous culture as well said they have like their own beliefs, or some sort of mythology that it became like they attach in a way or another to the land and to specific, like crop that had some sort of cultural history or legacy. So for them, it coca leaves were part of their own legacy or their own culture, and they use their own like these kind of primitive, uh, uh, like like as a sort of medication, instead of resorting to modern, doctors, or to get like some sort of prescription or different diagnosis. So they use their agricultural outputs as a way to as a way, as a medication as well. So they use, this leaf to treat, cold, for example. So it's part of their own culture, the cultivation in itself, and the leaf itself. It had like this. They inherited this from ancestors, that it's part of their own culture. So that's why, so they started to mobilize against the coca eradication program. And in these struggles, actually, Morales was a member in the parliament, and he got expelled because he mobilized, people against this coca eradication program in 2002, and this actually increased, his credential as an opposition leader that actually opposed the existing establishment, and it increased, the people increased, level of trust and confidence as of the in his discourse, or in his anti-establishment or anti-elite discourse, because of this actual practices. So actually, and he became the president of the Unified Peasant Confederation, and this is in his own words how he defended the coca growers in the region, Chapari region. So a main base of it, that was like the main base of his support, and he refused, to equate, the growing coca to drug trafficking or cocaine, as he mentioned, like a main base of his support in the region. Only a minority of the coca grown in the region winds up as cocaine. They don't use it as drug. So arguing that most is used for traditional purposes, it's part of their indigenous culture, and it's opposed to drug trafficking. But the problem is one of the man, the coca is not cocaine. So he actually asserted, the that like this kind of growing coca, it's part and parcel of the indigenous community, the culture of the indigenous community, and he rejected the notion or the official discourse and the US sponsored program that coca is cocaine, in order to legitimize, the coca eradication program. So he led the movement between the coca growers that to defend, the right in cultivating and growing coca. So with the pre-existing cycles of resistance, Morales actually managed to establish extensive and wide networks of activist and leftist supporters. So he reached beyond like the Chapari region in order to get more indigenous communities, or to appeal to and to articulate their own demands, and to echo, their own concerns. If you here he used as well like the same symbolic activities by using, the indigenous clothing to transmit, this message that he is one of the people. And again, not only these symbolic practices or these kind of highlighting indigenous culture, or assigning meaning to different meaning to growing coca, or to appeal to the movement, but also he offered like a distinct national economic program. He campaigned on a different economic platform, as I mentioned, and this enabled him to programmatically distinguish himself from Qatarista parties or other indigenous parties, as Pachacuti or Qatarista parties. And one of the most important, one of the strongest, his strongest opposition was Podemos as well in 2002. By 2005, Podemos actually included some A&D members, some from the existing establishment, some of the existing political elites. So this actually eroded its anti-establishment credential, and and enabled Morales and his movement to be the only movement or the only political party in the political scene that actually had credential while mobilizing against the existing elites, or while articulating anti-establishment discourse or campaigning on this anti-establishment platform. And he had like this alliance beyond, as I mentioned, he reached beyond Cochabamba and Quechua speaking areas in order to include Aymara groups as well in different areas. This actually enabled him, and here you have with numbers in order to support this. So you have here 2000 elections in comparison to 1997. So in 2002, MNR actually finished first as well and it gained roughly 22.5% of the national votes. But the movement to socialism, Morales movement, came second with roughly 21% of the national vote, comparing to only 4% in 1997. And you see here Pachacuti, the movement, one of the indigenous movement, it actually gained only 6.1% of the national vote. So it became like 2002 was very telling or indicative to the rising power of the movement or its wide social appeal. And here you have like the share of vote, like people who voted for the Morales movement in 2002 elections and 2005 elections. So people who self-identified indigenous in 2002 elections who supported the movement, it was like roughly 38%, and then increased to 71% in 2005. So not only indigenous, but also like mestizos who self-identified themselves as mestizos, but they speak indigenous languages. So they actually they were 27.5% in 2002, and they reached to 64% in 2005. Even mestizos who speak only Spanish, that they didn't have any kind of indigenous lineages, so they increased from 11.5% to 34.2% in the 2005 elections. Whites, people who identified themselves as whites, so the percentage actually increased from 6% in 2002 elections to 31.6% in 2005 elections. So it was like his electoral constituencies actually was the voters actually were wide. Speak different indigenous language, or mestizos who speak only Spanish, and even people who self-identified themselves as whites. So I think the connection, there is something with the connection. Hopefully we can finish soon. So how Morales actually framed, his struggle, and how he actually didn't like instill any kind of hatred in society, or didn't actually invest in this antagonism between indigenous communities and other indigenous communities, or other like different national groups. So that's why he appealed to non-indigenous population in 2005, that enabled him to reach power. So actually, he framed this as like a multicultural or multinational state that everyone has the right to their own or his own the community to its own culture, but with this kind of multiculturalism, there is a unity and respect of the diversity, and then we need to all come together so we can live united. So he again like highlighted, this unity within diversity, within the context of cultural diversity. So we want to govern with our indigenous ancestors models. It- Again, like to appeal to indigenous population or indigenous communities. So he admitted, their the right or his speeches and discourse of preserving or highlighting indigenous ancestors models and their right to preserve their cultural autonomy. It actually appealed or resonated with their demands for cultural autonomy and dignity. So they have like different form or different conception of participation, community work, and honesty. And I know that we are different not only within nations but among nations as well. So it's kind of it's by nature we are different, not only within nations but as well like between different nations. But these differences um, uh, can be used in order to promote, unity and support for life for entire, or for humankind in his own, to save humankind in his own words. So from those differences among the various nations must be respected. He again highlighted, the differences, but in the respectful approach to these diversities and these differences between different communities and between different nations. So everyone has the right to preserve every community has the right, national group the groups, they have the right to preserve their cultural autonomy and to practice their own cultural practices or inherited cultural practices, or to revive their own inherited cultural model. But what better among political leaders, presidents, or with social movement leaders than coming together to think about how we can support life and humankind. We need to create and come together to save lives and to save humankind. So this is like how he actually framed the struggle in Bolivia. And like taking this or approaching this from cultural angle or constructivist angle, so you need to highlight or to examine, how political actors and political leaders actually created different discourse or different discursive practices that resonated with wide segments in society, and they started to internalize new norms and to assign different meaning to their social and political context that enabled the movement as well to magnify or to appeal, to attract like different adherents and to magnify its own discourse and to reach beyond their narrow regions or narrow indigenous community. Um, okay, so we'll leave it there. And next week, and actually we almost covered like Bolivia, because we talked about this anti-neoliberal mobilization before, and we highlighted, this ethnic mobilization and inclusive or non-exclusionary approach of the movement to socialism. So we will talk more about populism in Ecuador and in Venezuela next week. And especially all after, like we will give like some sort of historical background briefly about Venezuela, because we talked about the collapse of the party system there before. And then we will focus on Chavez discourse and how actually his movement, again, as he as a political outsider and his populist movement, um, attracted or appealed to wide masses, and to what extent this affected the quality of democracy, or whether or not this would be an alternative to the liberal representative paradigm of democratic governance. So, okay, so that's all for today, and see you next week. Bye.